Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm really delighted to have Alice Maynard CBE and DBA, a Doctor of Business Administration, which is a long process of about 4 years. And deep respect for that. I've always wondered about doing it, but this lady actually did it. Alice was recommended by one of the other guests that we had on, Kevin Hogarth, who's been a chief people officer to a number of organizations. And Alice is doing so many things. She is not only a NED, different organizations such as the Financial Conduct Authority, she's also chair of various organizations. Particularly, she's going to talk about University of York on the governing body there. She's a mentor, she's a coach, and she's an advisor. Without further ado, welcome, Alice. It's great to have you on the series.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
Well, this is lovely. Let's begin by, I'm dying to know, CBE, that's no small achievement. We have MBEs, we have OBEs, MBEs, my bloody effort, OBEs, other buggers' efforts. But CBE, that's takes a bit of doing. And anybody who has that, I have a lot of respect for, not respect for whatever anybody achieves, but CBE, what did you get it for?
I got it for services to disabled people and their families when I was chair of Scope. So I was chair of Scope for about 6.5 years. You never know whether you're going to get these. I mean, you never know. You don't know that you're being put forward even. And you don't know, the people that put you forward don't even know what level, as it were, you're going to be awarded. So nobody knew until I got the letter in the post. And in fact, then you're not allowed to tell either until it's announced what it was that I got. But that's what I got it for. And it was, and I know the OBE is other buggers' efforts, but frankly, I think the CBE is countless buggers' efforts. Because I would say that, you know, what was achieved at Scope was not just my doing. Yes, sure, I was chairing it and we did a lot, but I had a fantastic board, brilliant executive team, and endless volunteers and staff who were just making an amazing difference, members, long-standing people with cerebral palsy who had been supporting the organization for years and years and years. And those are the people that got a CBE, actually.
No, it's very nice. I had someone who got the Nobel Peace Prize, but actually in his case, it wasn't just him. There was a group of about 30 of them that got it for the work that they did. And I think that's quite nice. But I went to visit Scope and see Mark Hodgkinson, who was one of your CEOs at the organization. I'm just very impressed by the work they did. And it takes me on to the DBA, the Doctor of Business Administration, which you did at Cranfield. What was the topic? It was to do with transportation and disability, I think, was it not?
That's correct. I couldn't possibly at this juncture reel off the title.
No, go on. I'm dying to hear.
I can't remember.
Oh, right.
It's something access to heavy rail stations, the inclusion of disabled access, I think, or something along those lines. But it was, so they're interesting, these doctorate things, because you go wanting to do something, you know, really mega, and you get there and you find you do end up counting angels on a pinhead. So the pinhead that I was counting angels on was heavy rail stations, which is not things like light rail, trams, undergrounds. It's the big stuff in the national rail network. And it was about the economic value of lifts versus ramps versus stairs. So that's what I ended up doing.
Well, that's got to be better than two other people I knew who did PhDs. One was in underwater cement mixing for offshore oil rigs. And the other one who announced quietly when asked by her sergeant major on the parade ground, Miss Jenkins, you've got a doctorate. What's that in? A PhD. Sergeant Major, it's in equine herpes. Oh, right. Okay. Thank you, Mom. Sometimes these are a bit of showstoppers, but well done on the dedication to that cause, which reminded me when I looked at your very good LinkedIn site. There's a lovely correspondence with lots of support from people about the question not to ask a disabled person who's sitting in a wheelchair waiting on a train to be taken off it. What's the question they shouldn't ask, or the assumptions they shouldn't make?
So actually, the question they shouldn't ask is somebody coming to get you? Because I don't know, and that's why I'm sitting there. The assumption they should not make is somebody will be along shortly. Because actually, I'm not even sure that they're making an assumption. A lot of the time, I think they are just trying to brush off the responsibility. So actually, it's kind of, if they say that to me, then they don't have to say, I'll find somebody for you, or has nobody come yet? Let me sort that out. I'm suspicious about the rationale.
Yeah, and I would be tempted if I saw you there to go, Alice, can I help you? Can I get you off the train? But that would probably be disastrous because, of course, there'd be no ramp and I'd end up sort of messing it all up and you'd probably be thrown from the wheelchair. What's the advice?
I would not allow you to.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't.
Allow you to. It would give you a hernia, if nothing else.
Yeah, well, I think the weight of the electric wheelchair is pretty big, isn't it?
Correct. It's mine is relatively light, but it would still give you a hernia. It's about 113 kilos, I think.
Yeah, no, that's more than my workout, I think. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, look, one of the things that you and I discussed at the beginning is people's awkwardness about when they meet someone who has a disability or an impairment. Do they talk about it? Do they mention it? And we were saying, and I thought it was a really good point, had it been a few years ago, you would have thought, just, back off, this is none of your business. But actually, your point you made to me, which I thought was quite helpful, was that you could see it then is a bit of an issue for people because they're not quite sure whether to listen to you or ask you, or they're curious about what is the disability and could they understand about it in order to better connect with you. Would you just perhaps talk about what your own disability is, if you wish to? You don't have to, and how people could best approach this kind of thing, because everybody's different and some like it, others don't. Like my sister-in-law doesn't want to be kissed on the cheek. She just doesn't want you anywhere near her. Whereas other people want to be greeted and want big Irish hugs if they're my wife. So what's your story and what's your advice?
So let me do that the other way around. So what I would say is, don't make it the first thing that you ask somebody. Engage them in conversation first, please. That might give you some idea of whether or not they are comfortable. And to be honest, a lot of people aren't. Now, I am these days, but I'm quite long in the tooth. And if you'd asked me a lot earlier, I might not have been quite that keen. If you look at one of my LinkedIn articles, talks about an experience I had at a networking event where I was listening to what the other person was saying about themselves. And then the next question they asked me was, so what's your problem?
Wow.
To which, of course, I said, I don't have one. After which it all kind of deteriorated from there. So I would really want to stress that you need to be careful around this question. And it is not a problem. It's not an issue. It's not a challenge. Well, it might be, but not in the way that a lot of people approach it. It does not make me brave. So there are a number of things about asking that question that you need to be a bit cautious about. I think sometimes, as we were saying, it does prevent people from engaging further in conversation because they're kind of tied up in their minds. And so, just for clarity, what I've got is something called spinal muscular atrophy. It's progressive. genetic neurological condition. It means that I get weaker and weaker as I get older. So when I started out in life, actually I toddled, but then I kept falling over. And then I walked with calipers, then I had a wheelchair. Then considerably later, in my 40s, I needed to start using personal assistants in order to help me do the everyday tasks. And now I'm pretty much a full-time personal assistance user and an electric wheelchair user. That's how I describe myself when people ask me what my access needs are. I don't tell them what my impairment is, because actually that doesn't help them. People with my condition come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and there is an adult onset, which means that you might still be walking at the age of 40 or 50. So it's a question certainly you can ask, but you need to ask it pretty carefully.
Yeah, it's, I'm sure, a huge minefield that people insult others, get it wrong themselves, and then everything goes downhill, as you described. And would people be able to ask, what are your access needs?
Absolutely, they need to ask me what my access needs are, because if they don't, they're not going to know how to include me effectively. And each disabled person's access needs may be slightly different, or mine might coincide with someone who isn't, someone might be a support user, personal assistance user, who's not a wheelchair user. The two don't necessarily go together. And it may well be that if you've got visual impairment, you want large print. Well, if you've got a learning difficulty, you also want large print. So it's not, you can't make the assumption that because somebody's a wheelchair user, they're going to be the same as every other wheelchair user. And actually, one of the big issues in the access field is that wheelchair users will sometimes make the assumption that if they give somebody a bit of advice, actually that will suit all wheelchair users. And the size of the toilets on the Eurostar and the size of the wheelchair space on LNER trains were originally advised by wheelchair users who thought they knew, and actually that the Eurostar access has destroyed my capacity to have a pee on a Eurostar, and the space in the LNER trains prevented my sister from sitting at the table. Right. So you don't ask one wheelchair user what they advise on something. There are people called access consultants. They are very important people. They are trained and qualified. They're like architects. You wouldn't ask your next door neighbor, who is a plumber, even to build your house.
No, I think it's a good point you make, and it's a bit like I'm fascinated by the whole microbiome and what makes up the microbes of our stomach. And my microbiome and yours and mine and my wife's and my grandchildren's children, everybody's very different.
Yeah.
And this idea of both inclusivity, but also respecting difference, and that everybody is unique, and to understand each person from their perspective. What is it that old Christian saying? Treat your neighbor as yourself. No, treat your neighbor as your neighbor would like to be treated. Is better. Talking about other people, you were recommended by Kevin as someone he finds very inspiring as a leader. Who would you call out, people that you know well, that you think are very inspiring leaders, that a quality about them that you admire? Perhaps, CEO level maybe, but it doesn't have to be that level, but just someone that is running a large organization or something.
So when you asked me about this earlier, you asked me for two, and I really struggled to narrow it down. I know lots of inspiring leaders, but I picked two. So the first of those is Jim Harrer. He's the deputy. He's the permanent secretary of His Majesty's Revenue and Customs now, of course. And I picked him because I find him I used to be on the HMRC board, and I found him really even-handed, calm in the face of disruptive, or possibly even what I might describe as seismic events, prepared to speak truth to power, which I think is really important, and just a really wise, measured man. And the other person I picked is someone called Bernadette Conroy, who is social housing regulator and also one of my colleagues on the Financial Conduct Authority board. And I picked her because she is an amazingly strategic systems thinker. She's always well prepared for meetings, and she's always willing to speak her mind, but she does that really constructively.
Fantastic. Well, it's lovely when you come across so many in your time, and I think it's a great skill to look for the good in others. It's very easy for us to criticize others. And I was just reading a autobiography by someone, and they'll remain nameless. It's unfair because what I'm curious about was that they did get a number of people that they sang their praises, but they laced into a whole range of other people who were all famous public figures, politicians and other people in their profession. And I thought, wow, what's this all about? So very interesting. It's very telling about the person and their ego. But one of the things that people say about you is your humility and your humanity, but yet at the same time that lovely drive that you have. What experiences have shaped your leadership as others experience you today, Alice?
So I think that I want to pick out three things probably. One is my school experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that is largely responsible for my, what actually some people would view as my almost obsessive drive. So as teenage girls, so I went to a special boarding school for girls, disabled girls. I think we were probably handicapped girls in those days, actually. We were told that we would have to be significantly better than everybody else in order to justify our existence. Well, it wasn't entirely worded in that way, but that was definitely the message that came across. You are not worthy unless you really excel. And I spent a lot of my young adult life desperately trying to do that. And it wasn't until I got my second job, and my boss in that second job took a completely different approach and kind of, without saying, just gave me my value back, if you like. Because we went to Spain together in my early days in that job to launch a product. And he'd said to me, is there any reason why you couldn't go to Spain? I said, no, thinking I have no idea, but never mind, let's just say no. I was up for risk in those days, I can tell you. And when I got there, the bathroom was not accessible. So people had organised an accessible room for me. It wasn't. And I couldn't cope with the bathroom. And I was sitting there thinking, heck, what do I do? Anyway, I got hold of the boss and I said, look, this is really difficult, but my bathroom's not accessible. So he came and had a look, and he said, mine's much bigger than this. So he took me through to his room, and yes, indeed, the bathroom would have been fantastic, except I couldn't get through the door. So what he did was he picked the door up off its hinges and propped it up beside the doorway, which gave me the extra couple of centimeters that I needed to get my wheelchair through. So we just swapped rooms. And I found that actually quite inspiring. And when I later came across something called the social model of disability, which essentially says that people are disabled not by their impairment or their condition, but by the barriers that exist in society, like physical barriers or attitudinal barriers. That really was the standout example of social model action in progress for me. And it laid the foundations of my thinking about removing those barriers for whoever, not just for disabled people, but removing barriers in our workplaces so that people can do their best work. And so then my second thing about what a good non-executive director is, and the risks that you need to take to retain your integrity, came when I was recruited to the board of the National Information Forum, which was a non-profit organisation which researched and produced accessible information. It doesn't exist anymore, so I can happily talk about it. And it was a founder-led organisation, and the chair of the organisation was the husband of the founder. So it was very much a kind of incestuous affair, I think I would call it. And they treated the board like a puppet. And I was aware, even in those days, and I don't really know where that came from, that that the board owned the strategy. And I really butted heads with the chair and the founder, as the rest of the board just looked on, and they kind of agreed with me in private, but not strongly enough to speak out. And then I found that when the next AGM came along, I was summarily ousted. So that was what the price that I paid for trying to do my job effectively. And it taught me something about the backbone that non-executive directors need in order to do their jobs properly. And then the other thing that is kind of integral to my leadership, I suppose, is that interest in continuous improvement at board level and in board development. And that arose out of my experiences at Scope, because I really wanted to help to create the best performing board that I could. The board previously had had a lot of problems and caused a lot of problems with the executive. And I wanted a really productive and solid relationship with our executive. And that led me to work on a board development plan and a life cycle diagram for trustees, and to bring in board evaluation, which was extremely unusual in the sector. And we pretty much flew solo developing the framework. And we learned a lot as we went along about what good questions were. People needed to know what good looked like. If you said, are we doing this well? People need to know what that means. And also, if you're going to ask a load of questions, you really want to know what you're going to do with the answers. Otherwise, you're gathering data that people are making an effort to give you, and then you're just idly sitting by. And I eventually got an external board evaluation company in from the commercial sector, because I wanted to go, okay, so we think we're doing okay in the sector, but how do we compare with the private sector? Now, one of the things that was being bandied about a lot in those days was how much the non-profit sector needed the private sector to help it have good governance, etc., etc., etc. And that was not the outcome of our external board evaluation. They were quite shocked by how good our board meetings and our board governance was. So that was really, I found that really encouraging. And I still, even if I'm, where I'm not chairing boards, I will still try to inculcate that that value of continuous improvement, and encourage and support any efforts by chairs and other non-execs to promote that.
Fantastic. Well, what great stories. And I'm particularly taken by the boss who swapped rooms and took the door off the hinges. Just a real example. And I, like you, work with a number of CEOs and exec teams. I'm about to go off and with an exec team in America for their offsite. And time and again, I also get involved with between the exec team and the board, where the two sides are not understanding each other. They don't understand each other's terms or what their job spec or what their satisfaction and success criteria are on a page. And it does cause a lot of drama. So I think you're desperately needed, your skills there. There's been a number of highs in your life and a number of lows, I'm sure, Alice, but I am often curious what people have learned from their darkest moment and the lesson that's then helped them in the future. What about you?
So I think probably I've had a few dark moments, as you can probably imagine, but I think my darkest moment was when I was working in a company as opposed to consulting, and I brought a grievance against my manager because I couldn't bear any longer the level of bullying and discrimination I was being subjected to. There was definitely disability discrimination in there. And I found that a really difficult process. And actually when people, because I work in the equality and inclusion field, people often talk to me about their experiences of discrimination and harassment, and they are angry and they want to bring grievances or whatever, take people to tribunal. And I never advise them not to, but I always try to highlight for them how difficult that process is, because it's stressful, it can be emotionally destructive, and it's just a very hard process to go through. I was not successful in my grievance, and one of the reasons for that was because a very old-fashioned retired HR manager was put in charge of the investigation, and he didn't even know what an impairment was. So he had no understanding of disability discrimination. It hadn't existed when he was working. Gender discrimination had existed. There'd been a Racial Equality Act, but nothing else. And one of the things that taught me, that experience, was that I should really, if I'm finding things difficult, and I'm not saying everybody else, but I should cut my losses rather than try and still do a good job in a job that is actually destroying my mental health and affecting my self-esteem. So I couldn't actually, after that, apply for another job for a couple of years because I just didn't have what it took.
Wow. Well, well, firstly, I can't imagine how tough it is. Secondly, I've come across a number of people who've had to have difficult cases, tribunals, whatever it is, divorce cases, and it's hugely emotionally charged. And it reminds me about a bit of advice somebody gave me about when you're working for a white-collar psychopath. And I worked for one in the military, actually, who became very famous. And some of the senior levels in different organizations do seem to attract the white-collar psychopaths who love the power and the status. And they do enjoy gaslighting and bullying people. And one bit of fine advice I got is you won't be able to change them. So just get out of there, because they're going to carry on being a psychopath. They'll pick another victim and they'll taunt them and pull the wings off that little fly or whatever it might be that they really enjoy, or using a magnifying glass to burn its feet or whatever it might be, and in the way that sort of cruel children do. And that you, a bit like you said, just cut your losses if it's destroying your mental health, because the problem is that when you then go through the discrimination and the tribunal and the grievance, you're taken through it even more. and everything's highlighted on you, and they often see you as the difficult one. Now, as you said yourself, I wouldn't put people off doing the right thing, but sometimes the system doesn't serve you well, and you are, like, for example, I lost a huge amount of money, mainly what I'd inherited from my late mother, who died. Not an awful lot of money, but I'd saved up a lot. And I got defrauded by some criminal fraudsters on property. And we tried to make it work for about 10 years, but it was just breaking us. In fact, it probably killed my first marriage, I think, looking back. Eventually, there was a court case with about 26 people who'd been defrauded by this criminal woman who did go to jail. But we never got our money back. And it just put us through hell for another 3 years. We helped the police and we got her in jail, which was in some ways justice done, but we never got our money back. And she's probably squirreled it away somewhere, waiting to come out of jail and go and live off the earnings of her crime. So it doesn't mean you don't do anything about it, but I just think, as you wisely advise people, just be aware. Everything in life is possible. Be prepared to pay the price and live with the consequences. But are you prepared to pay that price? And are the consequences worth it? Sorry, you got me going on one there, but as you can see, it resonated for you. Any further thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, that consequences thing, I think, is really important. You kind of almost have to imagine yourself at the other side of it and work out what you're going to get, and is it really worth it, and what might not happen that you imagine is going to happen. So what happens if the person doesn't go to jail, or you don't get your money back, or you don't get satisfaction, or the tribunal doesn't agree with you? What then, and how is that going to leave you? I've done quite a bit of NLP in relation to my coaching. And one of the things, when I was very young manager, I went on one of the first NLP courses in the UK and qualified as a practitioner then.
Was it with Bandler and McKenna? Because I did one of those.
No, it was actually with something called the UK Training Company.
Okay.
But they were trained by Bandler and Grinder.
Yeah.
So, and I just remember one of the things that they talked about in relation to food and relationship with food was, before you eat a piece of chocolate cake, think about how you're going to feel when you've eaten that piece of chocolate cake, and then that will help you decide whether you want it or not, where people just ate for eating's sake. And I quite often apply that piece of advice to all sorts of things. You know, what's this going to be like when I'm at the other side of it? And actually, is that what I really want?
Yeah. I think very, very wise lessons learned from personal experience. Bit more experience I'd love to hear from you. And the whole point of this podcast is to share your wisdom and experience anyway, as you know, Alice. Taking yourself back to Alice Maynard, aged 16 to 18. What bit of advice would you give to Alice then, from the age you are now, if you'd gone back in your DeLorean back to the future and you'd go, Alice, don't worry about this, but this is really important? What would you say to your young self?
I think that's kind of relates to what I was saying about my school experience and being told that we had to be significantly better than everybody else. And I think the advice would be, actually, that's not true. You are enough. You are enough. And if you strike out and you take risks at work or in your life in general, what's the worst thing that can happen? And if it happens, what's so bad about that? And just, you are enough. You can do it. I wish somebody had actually told me that, instead of me spending, actually, I had a kind of physical breakdown when I was in my early 30s, well, or late 20s, I think it was. Not long and not bad, but as a result of just working ridiculously hard in order to make up for being me.
Mm.
So I'm enough.
Yeah, it's so interesting you mentioned that. I'm just going to look on my Audible, but there's one of the crucial. No, it's not Crucial Conversations. One of the books I've been listening to recently is this point. Yeah, it was about the fact that we're about character. It's about character. That was what it was. Just trying to find the book. The Road to Character by David Brooks. I just finished reading it, and that how, in many ways, in the last number of years, we've become more self-focused, me, and I want to be a superstar and social media and look at me, and rather than someone's character, which will stand the test of time, and integrity and humility and humanity and courage and things like this, that it's all what's in it for me. And I do think that your experience there, that you didn't feel you were enough unless you were exceeding everybody else. And I look back at, and I mentioned it to you when we were chatting just before as we were warming up, that my teacher told me I was thick and I was going to be a dustman because she didn't know. She just thought I was not trying hard enough because I couldn't read properly and my spelling was awful and my maths was terrible. That she said I was going to be a dustman because I was thick. And that was really going to be my life story. And I've been since trying to prove her wrong. Hence being a visiting professor at the business school and things like this. But it's all trying to prove to somebody. And it does catch up with you because you break yourself, as you were saying. Thank you for that. The next one, we're going to go round a little, the Inspiring Leadership Compass, the work that Lee, my wife, did, and I sort of supported her in it, about, what makes high-performing leaders and teams. And there's many thousands of leadership models, and you've studied many of them, Alice, I'm sure, written about them, designed your own probably. But just if you humor me and follow this one around, moral quotient, what did you learn when you let your own values slip? I'm always interested with people.
So I think the standout example of that for me was when I met my husband, ex-husband now, and we were out shopping. We weren't married by then. We were out shopping. It was early in our relationship. And we went to one of these big out-of-town places where we had the car, and we loaded up a trolley. And when we got back to the car, instead of unloading the trolley, my husband pushed it up the wheelchair ramp for the wheelchair into the car. And I said, "We can't take that, that's theft." And he said, no. And I said, well, he said, "It's fine." So I said, "No, it's not. And I don't want to take it." And he said, "Well, okay, I'll promise you I'll take it back when I go back." And I said, "Okay," naively. And later he told me that he'd actually dumped it in a moment of candor, which was quite rare. He told me he'd dumped it. That was probably quite a bit later. I think it was a month to 6 weeks later. And I was absolutely horrified. And at that juncture, I should have said, "Do you know what? This is not the right relationship for me to be in." Instead, I carried on in that relationship. I eventually married him. And of course, it didn't work. Doesn't work.
Yeah, little small things. I was told by the chief people officer of ASDA, whose name will come to me in a minute, but she talked about TNT, tiny noticeable things, and it's these tiny noticeable things that make all the difference. It's the little things. It's how you behave in small things is how you behave in big things. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to getting Admiral Bill McRaven, Navy SEAL commander, on. And he talks a story you may have seen about first make your bed. So you begin the day, you make your own bed. Because at the end of the day, even if you've had a bad day, when you come back to your room, you have a bed that's been made that you made. And it's the first thing of the day that you've done, that discipline of making your bed. And I know many who don't bother, and the bedroom is a shambles, and there's no pride in what you look after. So that's a really powerful story I will always remember. Thank you. PQ, meaning and purpose. Some people talked about it being spiritual intelligence quotient, but if we call it purpose and meaning quotient, what gives your life meaning and purpose, Alice?
Knowing that I make a difference, or I can make a difference to improve the life of others. And that is generally through work. It could be through other things, but for me, it's really through work. And I say that, my purpose in life is to make a difference to society through the effective organization of organizations, because that's what I'm good at. Occasionally people suggest that I perhaps ought to, I don't know what you do, apply to be a people's peer in the House of Lords or whatever. I am not a legislator. I would not wish to be a legislator. It's not what I do. I sort organizations out. That's what I'm good at.
And you'll never be out of work. We've got a lot of organizations that need sorting out. Next one, Alice, health quotient. What would be your top tip on how you manage your physical health and your mental health? A tip on each.
So certainly the physical health, whenever you read this elsewhere, there's always exercise in it. I was reading something, I think it was in the FT over the weekend, and there was stuff about taking a run or whatever, and I'm always going, yes, but I can't do that. So my thing for me is ensuring I've got good diet, and I'm hydrated, and that I have the right amount of sleep when I can get it, and I have a great belief in an hour before midnight is worth two afterwards, or however many afterwards. I can never remember the end of the thing. I used to swim, but that's not possible at the moment. I'm hoping to go back to it, but it's not possible at the moment. So that's certainly for my physical health, that's important. For my mental health, that's also important, because if you're physically kind of better off, your mental health is better. But I sing for my mental health. So I belong to a barbershop chorus, and that's really important to me. It's partly the community of that chorus, but it's partly the actual act of singing is good for your mental health.
Yeah. And what is the name of your barbershop quartet?
Junction 14.
And can people book you?
Yes, they can book us. Please feel free.
Well, that's great. Look, I love it, and I always enjoy listening to barbershop quartets. One with your mentoring and coaching hat on is EQ, which, as you know, and we were talking about this, that we've come across some particularly high IQ individuals who have seriously underdeveloped amounts of EQ. You can point them out in many walks of life. But how do you listen well to others, Alice? It's one of the key skills.
If I'm focused on listening to someone, then I listen well. And I'm actually quite good at playing back to people what it is that I've heard, generally speaking, using their terminology. I think that's one of the important things, because one of the things we do in kind of common listening, if I can put it that way, the sort of everyday listening, is actually interpreting what somebody's saying within our own framework. And although we often have to do that, it's not a great idea. So if you want to listen well, then you need to think what is their framework from which they are speaking, and listen with that. So if you don't understand one of the words they're using, or if you think you might be misinterpreting what they actually mean by it, then ask.
Yeah.
You know, you use this word. What does that actually mean for you? So that's really important. And sometimes when when my mind's on something else, or I'm invested in what I'm doing, or I'm reading my email at the same time as doing something else, then I may not be such a good listener, and that's an understatement. I'm a rubbish listener at that point. But sometimes when I'm listening to people, I may be listening so closely to the story, the content of what they're saying, that actually I might miss what is happening for them as a person emotionally or whatever. So one of the things I try to do is keep that kind of dual listening thing and not get completely involved in the kind of oh yes, that sounds really, etc.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Over my shoulder, there's a little book called How to Listen by Oscar Trimboli, who I've got coming on the podcast from Australia. In fact, we've had the recording. It's not yet been released, but fascinating man, a really good coach. But he spent his life's work is about helping people be better listeners. And he talks about 5 levels of listening. Firstly, listening to yourself. There's all that inner dialogue going on. Then you're listening to the content, the stories, as you say, of what they have. Listening to the context. Listening to the unsaid, what they haven't said, or what's missing, or what you're intuitively picking up, but they haven't said it. And then listening for meaning. And it is something we just in schools and everywhere else, certainly universities, goodness me, it's not even given any priority. Talking, speaking, public speaking, all that kind of projecting yourself, writing your, documents, getting your point across, but not listening. The next one is CQ, cultural intelligence, cognitive, cultural, collective intelligence. It's a sort of mix. And how do you, particularly someone who's so knowledgeable about exclusion and inclusion and diversity, how do you get on with people who are very different from you, Alice? What's your tip?
I think for me, it's about being open is really important. So we automatically start making judgments the moment we see people. We cannot help doing that. That is part of the human condition. So unless you're superhuman, you're not going to stop doing that. But being aware of that is really vital. So what am I assuming about this person that actually may or may not be accurate? But there's also, I think, a balance to be struck between being curious and asking questions so that you can actually understand them better, and being alert to areas that might be sensitive. And it kind of harks back to the conversation that we were having about me being a wheelchair user and what my condition is and whether that's okay to ask and all that stuff. And I like working with people who are different from me because I get fresh insights and we can generate much more innovative solutions to whatever we're working on because we are looking at things from different perspectives. And those don't have to be the commonly understood diversity characteristics. It could be just that we were brought up in different places, or we have different interests, or it's about find the difference as well as find the similarity in many ways. And I'm sure that many a time I screw up with somebody and I offend them or whatever. I would like them to tell me so that I can avoid doing it again, nicely preferably. But in any event, I hope they forgive me, because I think we lack forgiveness these days.
Very much so, and holding grievances. The last 3, let's do a quick fire, just because in the time I want to make sure we do cover them, because I think they'll all be interesting. Resilience. if there was a tip you'd give people about picking themselves up in times of adversity, you more than any have got many stories, but what would be your top tip to people?
So I think make sure you've got the support of other people, and other people who are going to be with you in your crisis or whatever it is, not just sympathize or try and give you advice, but actually kind of just live alongside you with it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is understand what you can learn from it. To what extent did you contribute to this, if at all? Mm-hmm. And actually, perhaps you can do something different next time.
Yeah.
For me, that's really important.
No, I love that. Learning in action. What I learn, what am I going to do differently? Brand, what have you learned from 360 feedback? I imagine you are good at doing that with boards and giving them 360 feedback, but what have you learned?
I've learned that people don't like giving it.
Really?
Yeah, particularly in the third sector, where many people are volunteers and they don't feel that it's okay to do it. And many people prefer being what they think is kind, but you need to be not cruel, but you need to be firm to be kind, I think, a lot of the time. And I prefer being told what I can change so that I can improve. And the best piece of feedback I've ever been given was from one of my team when I worked in the software industry. He told me that I didn't praise people enough, and it really took me aback. But actually, when I reflected on it, I thought, well, actually, I'm pretty task orientated. So I probably don't think about stopping and saying, fantastic job, guys. That was really good. And I've always remembered that. And I'm really grateful to him for telling me that.
Yeah, good on him. And particularly when we're so driven to achieve things that we think, well, just get on and do it. It's your job, you know.
Absolutely.
Legacy. What would be your advice to help someone find their legacy in their lifetime, not when they're dead?
I would say write yourself a personal mission statement. And there are hundreds of examples on the internet if you don't know where to start. Many of them are different, many of them are radically different, so you just have to find your own way. But I've had one since that time when I took the grievance against my manager, and I had such a ghastly time. I had a couple of years of therapy after that, and out of that came my personal mission statement, and that has really helped me to understand my legacy.
Fantastic. You've come across toxic leaders. Your manager was one of them. How do you turn around a toxic team? What would be your top tip from experience? Whether there's an individual or the whole team's gone toxic, what do you do?
So my top tip would be to try to identify whether there is an individual in that team that's causing the problem. And it may be that they're not in the right job. So this is where conversations and listening well become really, really important, because you've got to find out what's wrong before you can fix it. And making assumptions about what's wrong is a really bad idea. And sometimes an individual in a team might need permission to go. And sometimes they need permission to be themselves and ask for what they need. Because actually they just aren't able to do their best job in that situation for various reasons. So it may be that they become the best possible member in the team once they are able to express themselves effectively.
That's pretty good. I like that. Penultimate question is a favorite book, Alice, and I'm sure you've read many, but if there's a book that you'd recommend to people on leadership that you've enjoyed and that you think others listening around the world would enjoy too, what is it?
So a lot of the leadership books annoy me because they all say different things about being a leader, and I just kind of get, yes, but you can be a leader at all sorts of levels and in different ways, and that's not, this is unhelpful. But so what I really liked was when I was doing my MBA, I read Richard Norman's Service Management. So this was a long time ago, but it opened my eyes to something that he calls, I think, the customer employee circle. Sorry, Richard, if I've got that wrong. And that employees can't give great customer service if the company's not giving them great customer service too. So there's this kind of Janus almost of looking outwards and looking inwards as a leader. And that book really echoed for me and resonated with me, and I've never forgotten it.
So true. And I remember those who've worked with when Richard Branson is at his best, particularly in his airlines, that his focus was on making the experience of the employees so good that they then looked after the staff on the airplane so well, because they were being looked after so well. Now, in all organizations, they have highs and lows, but he did get that right. Okay, wonderful. So we're now going to do the 2-minute top tips, Alice. If you'd be kind enough just to introduce yourself personally, what you do, what you've done, just a little sort of thumbnail, and then what your top leadership tip is. We'll end at that stage.
So I'm Alice Maynard. I am a serial non-executive director really these days, but I also run a small company working in coaching and business advice called Future Inclusion. And I've been running that now for over 20 years. I am currently on the Financial Conduct Authority board as a non-executive on a small, very small local charity called the Cross and Stables Charity. And I am the chair of council of York University. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm not allowed to say that because that's the Canadian one. It's the University of York. But I think we were there first. That's
we were.
So my top leadership tip is to understand your strengths and your development areas as a leader, and never to be reluctant to ask for advice or help, no matter how stupid or weak that may feel. And then when you've had that advice, pay it forward.
Fantastic. Well, Alice Maynard, CBE, DBA, thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. You've really made me think, and I'm sure those organizations that work with you get great value from the experience that you bring and the radical candor that you add. So thank you. I've really enjoyed today.
Thank you. So have I.